At 6:47 a.m., a stranger looked and shoved a USB into my hand. Listen, it will save you. I froze hearing my husband talk about me. Hi, welcome to Family Revenge. I've got a story that might catch you off guard.
At 6:47 a.m., a stranger knocked on my door, shoved a scratched USB into my hand, and said, "Listen to it. It's horrifying, but it will save you." Minutes later, I sat in my kitchen, pressed play, and heard my husband's voice. It was muffled low. I could only make out words like medication and losing my mind. Then another voice appeared. A woman, calmly calculating how to have someone committed to a psychiatric hospital. And suddenly, the name they mentioned was mine. They laughed soft, satisfied, as if everything was already decided. But they had no idea. I was listening to every word. Thank you for being here with me. One small thing before we start, leave a comment and let me know. Have you ever trusted someone for years only to discover they weren't who you thought? Yes or no? I read every single one. Just a quick note. Some details in this story have been adjusted for narrative impact. The message behind it is what matters most. The man standing on my doorstep at 6:47 on a Tuesday morning was holding a USB drive and a debt that was older than my marriage. I had been making coffee. The cheap kind, the bodega brand that comes in a yellow can and smells better than it tastes. The kitchen was cold because the radiator in this apartment has never worked properly in winter, and I had learned years ago to stop asking the landlord about it. January light came through the window in thin gray sheets. From the living room, I could hear Garrett and Bryce laughing about something, a video, a headline, something meaningless and warm. That was the last ordinary sound I would hear in this apartment. The doorbell rang at 6:47. I set down my mug and walked to the door, and there he was. A man I had never seen. 63 years old, maybe older. Weathered hands. An old worker's jacket with a tear along the left cuff that had been stitched closed with thread that didn't match. He didn't smile. He didn't introduce himself. He held out a USB drive, small black, scratched along one edge, and said 7 words. "Open it and listen. This is terrible, but it will save you." Then he turned and walked down the stairs before I could respond. I stood in the doorway with cold air pouring in and a piece of plastic in my palm that weighed less than a house key. From the living room, Garrett called out without looking up. Honey, who was at the door. "Wrong address," I said. I closed the door. I put the USB drive in my cardigan pocket. I went back to the kitchen and picked up my coffee. And I said nothing because I have spent 52 years learning when silence is more useful than speech. Let me be clear about something. I am a woman who drives a 2009 Honda Civic to a public school where I teach other people's children algebra. I wear cardigans that pill at the elbows. I buy groceries with a list, and I clip coupons I don't need. That is the version of me my husband married. That is the woman Garrett Holloway, 54. A Manhattan construction contractor with a jawline smile and the practiced warmth of a man who has never meant a single word of it, believed he understood completely. It is not, however, the whole story. My name is Quasia Sterling. I am the sole heir to a $4.2 billion real estate empire, and nobody in this apartment knows that, except me. Garrett left at 7:01 with his gym bag and his phone already pressed to his ear. Bryce Holloway, my stepson, 24, recently graduated, loosely employed, carrying his father's smile, and none of his father's conviction followed. 3 minutes later, earbuds in backpack slung over one shoulder, waving without turning around. I locked the front door. I sat down at the kitchen table. I plugged the USB drive into my laptop. One file, audio, 38 minutes long. I pressed play. The first voice was Garrett's. Not the voice he uses with me, not the warm, half-distracted tone of a man asking about dinner or complaining about traffic on the BQE. This was flat, clinical. The voice of a man conducting business. He was talking to someone named Mark Beckford. I didn't recognize the name then. I would learn it later: a broker, a fixer, a man who solved problems that weren't supposed to exist. But in that moment, all I knew was that my husband was speaking to a stranger about me as though I were an item on an invoice. They discussed a psychiatric commitment, not in euphemisms, in steps. Medication first, something to make me erratic, visible, documentable, then a physician who would sign the papers, then a facility upstate, then control of the Sterling estate transferred through a power of attorney that I would supposedly sign while sedated. The birthday is the deadline, Garrett said. It has to be done before then. My birthday, February 18th. I paused the recording. I looked at my coffee. The steam had stopped rising. I picked up the mug, took a sip, and it tasted like nothing like water that had forgotten what it was supposed to be. I set it down and pressed play again. At minute 11, a third voice joined. Mark Beckford said something about dosage timing, about how the first 72 hours were critical. Then a laugh. Not Beckford's, Bryce's. There is a specific quality to hearing your child laugh at your destruction. It doesn't sound different from any other laugh. It has the same pitch, the same careless breath behind it. That's the part that will stay with me longer than anything else on that recording. Not the plan, not the medication, not the money. The laugh. Because it sounded exactly like the laugh I had heard from the living room 20 minutes earlier, when the morning was still ordinary and the coffee was still warm. She won't even see it coming, Bryce said. I closed the laptop. I placed both hands flat on the table. I breathed in through my nose and out through my mouth the way I teach my students to do before a test they're afraid of. The coffee mug sat 6 inches from my right hand, still half full, already cold. From the hallway, I heard the front door open. Keys. Footsteps. Bryce had come back for something he'd forgotten. He appeared in the kitchen doorway, backpack over one shoulder, phone in his hand, and he looked at me the way he always looked at me, casually, briefly, as if I were furniture that had always been in that room. "You look pale, Mom. Are you okay?" I smiled at my stepson the way I had smiled at his father for 9 years, with my whole face and nothing behind it. "Just tired, honey. Didn't sleep well." Bryce nodded, grabbed his charger from the counter, and left without looking back. The front door closed. The lock clicked. I stood in the kitchen for exactly 12 seconds, counting them the way I count measures of silence before I start a lesson, and then I sat down and opened the laptop again. The recording had 14 minutes left. At minute 24, a new voice entered. Not Garrett's, not Bryce's, not the broker's. This voice, I knew the way I knew my own breathing, its rhythm, its pitch, the particular way it curled around the ends of sentences like it was offering you a gift. Lenora Voss, my best friend. 10 years. The woman who called me every Sunday. The woman who sat beside me at my father's last birthday dinner and held my hand under the table when he coughed too long. The woman who introduced me to Garrett at a fundraiser in the fall of 2016 and said with that warm, conspiratorial smile of hers, "Trust me, Q, this one is different." On the recording, Lenora was not warm. She was precise. "Just coax her into signing the power of attorney," she said, her voice light, almost amused. "After she's penniless, I'll use our friendship to send her to a mental institution." Garrett laughed. "You're better than I thought." "Then we'll have all of the Sterling family's assets," Lenora said. And she laughed too, a short, satisfied sound, the laugh of a woman checking items off a list. I sat motionless. The kitchen faucet dripped. The stale coffee sat untouched beside my elbow, and my mouth was so dry I could feel my tongue sticking to the roof of it. I listened to Lenora describe the timeline she had built, not weeks, not months, but years of architecture. She had designed the conspiracy before the wedding, before the proposal, before the first dinner. She had chosen Garrett for me the way a contractor chooses a demolition crew, by capability, by willingness, by price. I want you to understand something about Lenora Voss. She picked out the dress I wore to the fundraiser where I met Garrett. She chose the color a deep navy that she said would bring out my eyes. She did my makeup in her bathroom while I laughed nervously about meeting someone new at my age. She told me I looked beautiful. She meant it the way a farmer means it when he says the calf looks healthy. She was styling me for my own execution. The recording ended at minute 38. I closed the laptop with both hands, pressing the lid down slowly, deliberately, as though sealing an envelope. Then I sat in the silence of my kitchen and let the facts arrange themselves. My husband wanted me committed. My stepson found it amusing. My best friend had engineered the entire thing. And somewhere beneath all of it, my father, a man I had kept at arm's length for years to protect my ordinary life, had known. He had known, and he had sent a stranger to my door with the proof. I did not cry. I did not scream. I picked up my bag, locked the apartment, and walked to the bus stop on Atlantic Avenue. The morning rush was already thick. I stood between a woman with 2 grocery bags and a teenager with headphones loud enough that I could hear the bass line through his skull. The bus came at 8:09. I got on, found a spot near the back window, pressed my earphone cord against my jaw, and made a phone call. Cassandra Hewitt answered on the first ring. 49 years old, Chief Financial Officer of Sterling Corporation, a woman whose voice carried the flat calm of someone who had been waiting for exactly this call. "It's me," I said. "I know," she said. No surprise, no hesitation. "You've heard the recording. Your father played it for me 6 weeks ago. He's suspected Garrett for 2 years. I've prepared some contingencies, but I need your confirmation." She paused. "How do you want to handle this?" The bus lurched forward. Through the fogged window, Brooklyn scrolled past bodegas, laundromats, a church with a broken sign, a man walking a dog that was too big for the sidewalk. My life. My ordinary, constructed, deliberately small life, built on top of a fortune I had spent a decade pretending didn't exist. A billion-dollar empire sat in my bloodline like a loaded weapon in a locked drawer, and I had spent 9 years pretending the drawer didn't exist. This morning, someone had kicked it open. "The only way to handle someone who thinks they've won," I said, "is to let them continue to think that way." 3 seconds of silence. Then Cassandra said, "I'll call Hank." "Do that. And Cassandra, nobody in my house can know. Not today. Not tomorrow. Not until I say." "Understood." I hung up. The bus turned onto Flatbush. A school bell rang somewhere ahead, thin and distant through the morning cold. I adjusted my coat, the same wool coat I wore every winter, the one with the fraying cuff that I never repaired, because a woman who repairs her own coat cuffs is a woman nobody looks at twice. The bus stopped in front of PS 247. I stepped off onto the sidewalk, felt the January air hit my face, and walked through the gate. The security guard nodded. A 4th grader waved. The principal passed me in the hallway and said good morning without slowing down. None of them knew. None of them would. The woman teaching long division at 9 o'clock was about to dismantle a criminal conspiracy, and she would do it without missing a single class. How do you look at your wedding photos when you know the groom was hired? I taught 3 classes that first day without error. Fractions long division, a brief introduction to negative numbers for the advanced group. My hands were steady. My voice was even. And somewhere between second period and lunch, I understood that the woman who walked into PS 247 that morning was not the same woman who had made coffee 6 hours earlier. That woman was gone. The one who replaced her had work to do. The next morning, day 2. I stood at the bathroom mirror, brushing my teeth, and let the memories come. Not the way memories usually arrive, soft, warm, tinged with nostalgia. These came like evidence. Exhibit A through Z reordered. The fall of 2016. An Upper East Side fundraiser for a children's literacy nonprofit that Lenora had insisted I attend. Lenora Voss, 46, a senior legal assistant with a warm laugh and careful eyes that missed nothing. My closest friend for 10 years, the woman who called every Sunday, who held my hand at my father's birthday dinner, who knew things about me that I had never told another living person. She had walked me across the ballroom floor that night, Her arm linked through mine and stopped in front of a man in a charcoal suit with a jawline smile. "I want you to meet a friend of mine," she said. "You'll like him." Garrett shook my hand and held it 1 second longer than necessary. He asked what I did. I said I taught math. He said his mother had been a teacher. His eyes were kind, his laugh was easy. I thought I had gotten lucky. On our third date, he cried, just slightly at the corner of his right eye while telling me about his father leaving when he was 11. I thought that made him safe. I thought vulnerability was proof of honesty. It turns out that was the audition, and I gave him the part. But now I had the recording. And on that recording, in a voice stripped of every tenderness I had ever believed in, Garrett told his broker, "I married her because I need capital. I knew her father was rich. I just didn't know he was that rich." 9 years. 9 years of birthday dinners and Sunday mornings and arguments about where to spend Christmas. 9 years of a love story that was never a love story. It was an acquisition. And Lenora, my Lenora, had brokered the deal. I rinsed my toothbrush. I placed it back in the holder. I looked at my face in the mirror and made a decision. I would not grieve this marriage. I would disassemble it. On day 3, I kept my afternoon appointment at a clinic on the Upper East Side. The waiting room had soft lighting and potted plants and a white noise machine that hummed like a prayer nobody was listening to. Dr. Lorraine Prescott came out to greet me herself. 57 board-certified psychiatrist, silver-haired, 15 years of quiet service to the Sterling family. She shook my hand and led me to her office, and when she closed the door, her clinical calm shifted into something harder. "The blood work came back," she said. She placed the lab report on the desk between us. "There are traces of a mild cognitive disrupting compound, consistent with 6 months of continuous ingestion. The profile it creates is textbook forgetfulness, emotional instability, confusion. Enough to make anyone look like they need help." 6 months. I thought of the herbal tea Lenora had given me last summer, wrapped in tissue paper tied with a ribbon. "For your nerves," she had said, squeezing my hand, "chamomile and something special from that shop in the village." I had brewed it every morning since. I had thanked her for it. "You need to stop immediately," Dr. Prescott said. "Can you document everything?" I asked. "Chain of custody, lab results, timestamps. I need this to hold up." She studied me for 3 seconds. Then she nodded. "I already started." I left the clinic at 4:15 and rode the bus back to Brooklyn. The lab report sat in my bag inside a manila envelope that Dr. Prescott had sealed and initialed. My hands smelled like antiseptic. My mouth was dry. And I was thinking about cameras. What kind of woman drinks poison on purpose every morning with a smile because the people watching need to believe it's working? This kind. The kind who has 46 days until her birthday and a conspiracy to unravel one thread at a time without snapping the whole fabric. The kind who understands that the moment Garrett or Lenora or Beckford suspects I know the recording becomes worthless, the evidence disappears, and my father's network loses its only advantage: time. So I would give them time. I would give them exactly what they expected to see: a woman growing slightly more forgetful, slightly more anxious, slightly more dependent. A woman who drinks her tea. That evening, I stood at the kitchen counter and filled the kettle. I opened the cabinet and took out the box Lenora had given me: chamomile, and something underneath. Something that tasted like nothing but worked like a slow eraser on the edges of my mind. I brewed a cup. I held it with both hands. I looked straight at the corner of the cabinet where I had found the pinprick red light of a camera 2 hours earlier, during a search I conducted while Garrett was at the gym and Bryce was out. And I took a long, slow sip. Somewhere on the other side of that feed, someone was watching. I wanted them to see a woman who suspected nothing. I wanted them to feel safe. Because safe people make mistakes. And I was counting on every single one. The detective placed a photograph of a dead woman on the table between our coffee cups and said, "I don't think she's dead." It was day 5. I had spent the past 2 evenings performing brewing tea, watching television, asking Garrett about his day, with the careful attentiveness of a wife who suspects nothing. The camera in the kitchen cabinet watched me. I watched it back without ever looking directly at it. And each morning, I left the apartment with a list of things I needed to learn before my birthday. The cafe was on a side street in Brooklyn Heights, the kind of place with mismatched chairs and an espresso machine that hissed louder than the conversation. Hank Rawlings sat in the back corner facing the door. 61 years old. Retired NYPD homicide detective, 28 years of casework behind him. He had the posture of a man who had spent 3 decades sitting in rooms where the wrong word got people killed, and his voice stayed low enough that the barista 10 feet away couldn't catch a syllable. He slid a manila folder across the table. Inside a printout of a Georgia court filing from 2009, a fraud case. The defendant's name had been legally changed afterward from Marcus Belford to Mark Beckford. The attorney who made the key evidence disappear was listed as a legal assistant attached to the defense team. Her name was Lenora Voss. Same method, Hank said. Same team. Psychiatric commitment asset seizure victim declared dead. Only the name on the file changed. I turned the page. A woman's face looked up at me from a hospital intake form. Eleanor Marsh, 31 at the time, daughter of a Boston commercial real estate family not as large as mine, but large enough to be worth destroying. She had been committed to a psychiatric facility in upstate New York. 6 months later, she was declared dead by suicide. Case closed. Estate liquidated. Beckford and an unnamed associate collected through a shell company registered in Delaware. You're telling me they've done this before, I said. I'm telling you they perfected it on someone else first. Hank tapped Eleanor's photo. But the death certificate has gaps. The facility closed 18 months later, loss of funding, staff scattered. No body was transferred to the family. No cremation record. I'm looking for Eleanor Marsh. I'm not sure she's dead. I stared at the intake photo. A young woman with dark eyes and a jaw set tight against something she couldn't name yet. I recognized that expression. I had seen it in my own bathroom mirror 3 days ago. I need you to understand what I felt in that moment. Not anger, not fear. A kind of sick recognition, like reading a book you've already lived. They had a playbook. I was just the next page. The same dosage, the same timeline, the same legal architecture designed to turn a living woman into a line item on a liquidation report. The only difference was that I had heard the recording before they finished the job. I closed the folder. Find her, I said. 2 days later, day 7, same cafe. Hank was already seated when I arrived. This time, he didn't start with a file. He placed 3 photographs on the table, face up, arranged in a row, like cards in a game I hadn't agreed to play. Lenora. In each one. At Sterling family events I had never attended and never been told about. The first, a charity dinner at the plaza 8 months ago. Lenora standing beside my father in a cream-colored coat I had never seen. The second, a board luncheon 6 months ago. Lenora shaking hands with a Sterling Corporation director, smiling the way she smiled when she wanted you to believe she belonged. The third, a private reception at my father's apartment 4 months ago. Lenora seated at his dining table, wineglass in hand, leaning forward as if sharing a secret. 7 meetings with your father in 8 months, Hank said. She's using the name Sarah Alexander, introduced herself as a close friend of the family, almost like a foster daughter, her words. She's positioning herself to be included in the estate. Lenora wasn't just stealing my husband or my money. She was trying on my life like a dress in a fitting room, checking the mirror, adjusting the hem, deciding if it suited her. She wanted to be me. Not metaphorically, literally. She wanted my father to see her as the daughter he'd lose when I was committed. She wanted the seat at the table, the name on the documents, the inheritance that would flow to the closest surviving relationship once I was declared unfit. What did my father say to her? I asked. Hank paused. He picked up his coffee, took a sip, and set it down with the deliberate patience of a man who had delivered difficult information for a living. He was very polite, Hank said. Warm even. Gave nothing away. But after each meeting he calls Cassandra Hewitt. Every time. Within 15 minutes of Lenora leaving, I sat back. The espresso machine hissed. A cold draft swept through the cafe as someone opened the front door and let January in. My father knew. He had known before I did, maybe before the recording existed. He had watched Lenora circle him like a woman measuring a room for new furniture, and he had smiled and poured her wine and called his CFO the moment she was gone. He had been waiting, not for evidence, for me. For the moment, I would stop pretending the locked drawer didn't exist and finally reach inside. I looked at the photographs one more time. Lenora beside my father wearing a coat paid for from my joint account with Garrett. My father's face courteous, unreadable, giving her nothing but rope. The question wasn't whether he knew. The question was how long he had been waiting for me to know too. There were 3 cameras in my home living room, kitchen, bedroom, and every one of them belonged to the man who was poisoning me. Hank's encrypted message arrived on day 9 while Garrett watched a basketball game in the living room. I read it in the bathroom with the faucet running, the phone tilted away from the mirror in case there was a 4th camera I hadn't found. 3 devices, all live streaming to a phone registered under a Delaware LLC, the same shell company Hank had connected to Mark Beckford. The same one that had liquidated Eleanor Marsh's estate 6 years ago. I turned off the faucet. I looked at myself in the mirror, and I made a choice that I suspect most people would not understand. I walked back into the kitchen, stood at the counter where I knew the camera was watching, and I broke down. Not really, but convincingly. I pressed my hands over my face. I let my shoulders shake. I made the small, ragged sounds of a woman who cannot hold herself together, the sounds they expected from someone 6 months into a chemical erosion of her own mind. I gripped the counter edge until my knuckles went white, and I let the kitchen light catch the tremor I manufactured in my fingers. From the living room, Garrett called out, "Are you okay in there?" "I'm just tired," I said, and I let my voice crack on the second word. "Long day." He didn't come to check. He never did. The game was in the 4th quarter. I heard him settle back into the couch, and I stood at the counter for another 2 minutes performing grief for a camera the size of a pencil eraser hidden in the cabinet corner above the stove. Somewhere across the city, Mark Beckford was watching. I knew this because Hank had told me the feed was live, and because I understood by now how these men operated. They watched, they measured, they waited for the data to confirm what they had already decided. And that night, according to the phone records Hank would pull 3 days later, Beckford sent Garrett a text at 11:47 p.m., 4 words. "The medication is working." Garrett read it in bed beside me while I pretended to sleep. I felt the blue light of his screen on my closed eyelids and kept my breathing steady. There is a particular kind of power in letting someone believe they are winning. It requires you to lose beautifully, convincingly, night after night. It requires you to cry on cue, and to remember, even as the tears run, that each one is a weapon you are choosing to fire. The cameras were not my cage. They were my stage, and every performance bought me another day. 2 days later, on a Tuesday evening I would not learn about until weeks afterward, a woman in a midtown apartment picked up her phone and read an anonymous text. The message was short. It contained a name, a marriage certificate number, and a Brooklyn address. Diane Mercer was 41, a pharmaceutical sales representative. She had spent 2 years loving a man who took her to restaurants in neighborhoods where nobody knew him, who never stayed past midnight, who kept his phone face down on every surface. She had asked once if he was married. He had looked at her with those careful eyes and said, "Do I seem like the kind of man who would do that to someone?" She called him. It took 4 rings. "Someone sent me a marriage certificate," she said. Garrett didn't deny it. He didn't apologize. He didn't explain. What he said was worse than any of those things. "So, what if you know?" His voice was flat, almost bored. "What do you have besides me?" She hung up. She sat on the edge of her bed in the dark with the phone in her lap and cried for 2 hours. Not the performed kind. The real kind, the kind that leaves your chest sore and your face swollen and your hands shaking with something that hasn't decided yet whether it's grief or rage. I did not know Diane Mercer yet, but somewhere in Midtown, a woman I had never met was about to make a decision that would change both our lives. And she was making it not because someone asked her to, but because a man she loved had told her she had nothing without him. That is a dangerous thing to say to a woman. It is the kind of sentence that turns sorrow into a search engine. At 11 p.m., Diane opened her laptop. She typed my name into Google. The first result was a PTA newsletter from PS247. The second was a photograph from a school fundraiser, me in a cardigan standing in front of a whiteboard smiling the way teachers smile at cameras. The third result was a Sterling Corporation board filing from 2014 listing a majority shareholder by the same name. She clicked it. She read it. She sat very still. The woman in the teacher's uniform, the wife she had been ready to pity, was the daughter of a man whose real estate holdings were worth more than some countries' annual budgets. And she was living in a rented apartment in Brooklyn, teaching fractions to other people's children, married to a man who was stealing from her in ways Diane was only beginning to understand. Diane stared at the screen for a long time. Then she picked up a grocery receipt from the nightstand, turned it over, and wrote down the address of PS247 in Brooklyn. She would go there tomorrow, not to confront, not to apologize, to understand. Because Diane Mercer was not the kind of woman who stayed in the dark once someone turned the lights on. And Garrett had just handed her the switch. For 8 months, my best friend had been teaching me not to trust myself, and I had been a perfect student. Diane Mercer never came to the school. Not that week, not the next. I would learn later that she sat in her car outside PS247 on day 12, watched me walk through the gate in my wool coat, and drove away without getting out. She wasn't ready yet, but she had seen enough to know that the woman Garrett was married to was not the woman she had expected. That knowledge was working on her. It would find me when it was ready. On day 13, I sat alone in the teacher's room after the last bell. The building was empty, that particular stillness that schools have when the children are gone and the fluorescent lights hum to themselves. I had a stack of ungraded quizzes in front of me, but I wasn't looking at them. I was looking backward. 8 months backward. I was reconstructing Lenora, not the Lenora from the recording. I already knew that woman. I was reconstructing the other one, the Lenora who had sat across from me at brunch every other Sunday, who had texted me at midnight when I couldn't sleep, who had held my hand at my father's dinner table. The Lenora who had been disassembling my mind in real time while I thanked her for the company. It started 7 months ago. I had mentioned to her that Garrett seemed distracted. He was coming home later, checking his phone in the bathroom, leaving conversations mid-sentence. Normal things that married women notice and file away. Lenora's response was immediate and warm. "You're overthinking it, honey. Garrett adores you. You're just stressed from work." I believed her. Why wouldn't I? She was my closest friend. She had known Garrett before I had. If she said it was nothing, it was nothing. So I put the instinct back in its drawer and closed it. 4 months ago, I forgot a parent-teacher conference. Not like me. I wrote it down, set a reminder, and still walked right past it. Lenora heard about it before I told her. Garrett must have mentioned it, and her voice on the phone was gentle, concerned, calibrated. "You've been so forgetful lately. Maybe you should see someone about that." She wasn't comforting me. She was calibrating me. Every conversation, every Sunday brunch, every late-night text was a measurement. How confused was I? How dependent had I become? How close was I to the profile they needed on paper to have me committed? She didn't just know about the conspiracy, she tended it. She pruned my confidence like a gardener removing branches that grew in the wrong direction until the only shape left was the one she had designed, a woman who doubted her own memory, her own instincts, her own right to ask questions. I want to make sure you understand the precision of what Lenora did. She didn't just lie to me. She made me believe my own eyes were liars, and then she held my hand while I apologized to them. I put the quizzes in my bag. I left the school, and I went to meet her for dinner. She had texted that morning, "Italian tonight, just us, I miss you." And I had replied with an emoji and an exclamation point, because that is what the version of me she expected would do. The restaurant was a small place on 46th Street, candlelit, the kind of spot where two women could share a bottle of wine and talk about nothing important. Lenora was already seated when I arrived. She looked expensive. New coat camel cashmere draped over the back of her chair. A watch I hadn't seen before, gold with a mother-of-pearl face. Her hair was freshly done. She smiled when she saw me, stood up, and kissed my cheek. "You look tired," she said. Not an observation, a check. "I am tired," I said, and I let my voice carry the weight she wanted to hear. "I don't know what's wrong with me lately." Sitting across from Lenora at that candlelit table, watching her smile with my money and probe me with my trust, I understood what an actress feels when another actress walks onto her stage uninvited, except Lenora didn't know she was the one being watched. "Have you been sleeping okay?" she asked, twirling pasta on her fork. "You seem a little scattered. I worry about you." "I don't know what I'd do without you, honestly," I said. I let my eyes go soft. I let my hand reach across the table and squeeze hers. "You're the only one who checks on me." She squeezed back. Her nails were freshly manicured. The wine was a $40 Barolo that she ordered without looking at the price. I barely touched my pasta. My appetite had been gone for 13 days, but the performance didn't require eating, only the appearance of trying. When the check came, she reached for it. "My treat," she said. I let her. The credit card she used was a joint supplementary card from an account that Garrett managed, which meant in the end it was my money paying for my own surveillance dinner. Outside the restaurant, she hugged me goodbye. Her perfume was something new, layered, expensive, unfamiliar. "You always have me," she whispered against my ear. "Always." I hugged her back and said nothing. Walking to the subway, I replayed the evening. The coat, the watch, the nails, and then the bag, the logo half turned against her hip as she had embraced me. I recognized the brand. I had given her the same one for her birthday last year, an older model. This one was current season. I already knew where the money had come from. She was wearing me while she dismantled me, and she had no idea that the woman she was dismantling had stopped being that woman 13 days ago. The pastor placed an old recording device on the desk between us and said, "I've been holding this for 3 years, waiting for someone to need it." 2 days after watching Lenora walk away in my money, I sat in a church office in Harlem trying to understand how deep this went. The answer was deeper than I had imagined. Pastor Eldon Graves was 71. Senior pastor of the Community Church of Harlem for 3 decades, a man connected to my family through Arthur Langley, who had contacted him on Cassandra's instruction. The office was small, wood-paneled across on the wall, and dust motes floating through the window light. He sat behind his desk with his hands folded and spoke the way pastors speak when they have carried something heavy for a long time and are finally setting it down. 3 years ago, he said, a couple came to see me. They said they were seeking guidance for a friend, a woman who was having psychological difficulties. They wanted to understand the process, commitment procedures, how a family could intervene if someone was a danger to herself. He pressed play on the device. Garrett's voice filled the office, younger, smoother, rehearsed. And beside him, Lenora. Not as a friend of the family, as a partner. They described a woman in clinical detail, forgetful, emotionally volatile, increasingly paranoid, prone to episodes of confusion that frightened her family. The details were too specific to be about a stranger, Pastor Graves said. I recorded it because something felt wrong. I didn't know who the woman was until Arthur called me last week. I sat in the wooden chair and listened to my husband and my best friend construct a version of me that didn't exist, not yet. 3 years ago, I was fine. I was sharp. I was teaching full-time and managing the household budget and remembering every appointment and every birthday. The woman they described to Pastor Graves was a fiction, a blueprint. They were building a diagnosis before they had a patient. The tea came later. The gaslighting came later. But the architecture, the language, the clinical profile, the legal framework for commitment that had been drafted 3 years before the first cup was poured. 3 years. While I was making Thanksgiving dinner and helping Bryce with college applications and believing I was building a life, they were building a cage. Every holiday, every anniversary, every quiet Sunday morning when Garrett kissed my forehead and Lenora texted me a heart emoji, all of it had been running parallel to a plan that required me to lose my mind on schedule. I thanked Pastor Graves. I put the recording device in my bag heavier than I expected, warm from years in his desk drawer. He walked me to the door and paused. "Is there anything you want me to do?" he asked. "You've done enough," I said. "Pray that I have enough patience not to do something I'll regret." He nodded. He didn't say he would pray. He said, "I think patience is the least of your gifts." And he closed the door behind me. 2 days later, day 17, Diane found me. She was standing outside PS 247 when I came through the gate at 3:30. I didn't recognize her at first, a woman in a dark coat, mid-40s, standing by the fence with her hands in her pockets, watching the building like she was trying to decide if the door would bite. But when our eyes met, I knew. The way you know when a stranger has been carrying the same weight you have. We walked to a cafe 3 blocks away. Same neighborhood, different place from where I met Hank. We sat across from each other with 2 cups of coffee that neither of us touched. I looked at Diane across that table and saw something I hadn't expected. Not an enemy, not a victim, but a woman who had decided that being lied to was not the same as being defeated. She spoke first. "He told me he'd never loved anyone as much as he loves me," she said. Her voice was steady, but her jaw was tight. I believed every word. For 2 years. I need to see what happens when those words cost him something. She placed her phone on the table screen up and scrolled through a thread of text messages. 2 years of conversations, pet names, plans, promises, the entire architecture of a second relationship documented in timestamps and blue bubbles. "I didn't know," she said. "I need you to know that." "I know," I said, and I meant it. The recording had made that clear. Garrett had kept his lives in separate rooms, and Diane had been locked in hers as thoroughly as I had been locked in mine. "I don't hate you," I said. "I just want to ask, do you want to see him pay the price?" She looked at me for a long moment. The cafe was quiet, spoons against ceramic, the hiss of a milk steamer rain beginning to tap the window. When she answered, her voice didn't waver. "I want to see him pay, not for you, for me. Because he told me I had nothing without him, and I need to prove to myself that he was wrong about that too." We didn't exchange numbers yet. We didn't make promises. We parted at the cafe door the way 2 people part when they know they will see each other again, but haven't yet decided what that will look like. I stepped into the cold wind and felt my phone buzz. Garrett. "I'll be home late tonight. You eat first." I stood on the sidewalk with rain on my face and typed back 2 words. "Okay, I'll wait." I meant something entirely different from what he would read. I was waiting, yes, but not for dinner, not for him to come home. I was waiting for the right moment, and every day, every performance, every sip of poisoned tea brought it closer. How do you test whether your own child is helping to destroy you without letting him know you already have the answer? I waited. That was what the text to Garrett had meant, not the patient waiting of a wife keeping dinner warm, but the disciplined waiting of a woman who understood that every day of silence was a day the trap tightened around the people who built it. By day 19, I had learned to wait the way a surgeon waits for anesthesia to take hold, motionless, precise, already knowing where to cut. That evening, I made soup. Onion, garlic, carrots, the cheap kind of meal that fills a kitchen with warmth and makes a home feel like a home. Bryce was sitting at the kitchen table, scrolling through his phone, earbuds around his neck, one foot tapping the chair leg. Garrett was at the gym, or wherever Garrett went when he said the gym. The camera in the cabinet corner was watching. I stirred the pot and let the steam rise between us. "Are you doing okay in Midtown?" I said, not looking up. "Yesterday I passed by and saw a lot of new construction there. Half a second. That was all it took." Bryce's thumb stopped moving on his screen. His jaw shifted a tiny lateral movement, the kind of tell a poker player would catch, and a mother definitely would. Then his thumb resumed and his voice came back casual and flat. "Yeah, Mom, I live in the dorm." He didn't live in the dorm. Hank had already confirmed it, a 2-bedroom apartment on West 54th lease signed 4 months ago, rent paid from an account Garrett managed. Bryce had been living there since October. The dorm room existed on paper for my benefit the same way the tea existed for my deterioration. Another set piece in a production I was supposed to watch without ever looking backstage. "Yes, that's right," I said. I was mistaken. I kept stirring. Under the counter, my left hand typed a text to Hank. "Midtown apartment, need the bill." Bryce left the table 10 minutes later saying he had homework. I sat alone with the pot of soup and looked at where he had just been sitting. That empty chair told me everything his mouth refused to. He knew. Not all of it. Maybe I still wasn't sure whether he understood the full scope, the medications, the commitment plan, but he knew enough. He knew about the apartment. He knew about the money. And he sat across from me every evening with the easy smile of a young man who had decided his stepmother's destruction was an acceptable trade for a 2-bedroom in Midtown. I poured the soup into a bowl. I didn't eat it. The appetite had been gone for 19 days, but I had learned to cook anyway because the camera needed to see a woman performing a life she still believed in. 2 days later, day 21, I sat in Dr. Prescott's office for the second time. The clinic was the same soft lamps framed credentials, the neutral antiseptic air of a place designed to make difficult truths feel clinical. But this time, Dr. Prescott didn't start with lab results. She started with a name. "Lenora Voss has contacted me twice in the past month," she said. I gripped the armrests of my chair. Not from surprise, from the effort of keeping my face still. She called the first time 3 weeks ago, identifying herself as a concerned friend. She described a woman forgetful, emotionally erratic, potentially a danger to herself. She asked about the process for involuntary psychiatric evaluation. Dr. Prescott paused. "The description matched you exactly. Down to the age, the occupation, the living situation. 5 weeks. That was what stood between me and a locked ward with my name on the door. 5 weeks and a woman who had been my closest friend for a decade, building my cage, one phone call at a time. The tea was the foundation. The gaslighting was the walls. And now Lenora was installing the lock, a formal psychiatric pathway that would make my commitment look like an act of compassion rather than an act of theft. "Can you continue taking her calls?" I asked. "And record everything?" "I've been recording since the first time," Dr. Prescott said. Her voice was steady, clinical, but beneath it I could hear the steel of a woman who had already chosen a side. "That's why I called you." She handed me a printed transcript of both conversations. I read them in her office, sitting in the quiet hum of the white noise machine. Lenora's words were careful, warm, convincing. She sounded genuinely worried. She sounded like a woman who loved her friend and was afraid of losing her. If I hadn't known better, if I hadn't heard the recording, if I hadn't sat across from her at dinner watching her perform, I would have believed every word. That was the part that frightened me most. Not the plan, the skill. I left the clinic at 4:30. The Upper East Side was cold and bright, the kind of January afternoon where the sun hits the buildings but gives no warmth. I checked the calendar on my phone. February 18th. 5 weeks away. 4 missed calls from Lenora. I called her back. "There you are," she said, and her voice came through warm and concerned, the voice of a woman who spent her Sundays checking on me. "I just wanted to see if you're okay. You've looked a little tired lately." "I'm fine," I said. "Just busy at school. You know how January is." You'd tell me if something was wrong, right? Of course, I said. You're the first person I'd call. I kept my voice steady enough that she would report exactly what she needed to hear, that the medication was working, that the target was softening, that 5 weeks was more than enough time. And when I hung up, I stood on the sidewalk and let the cold air hit my face and reminded myself that patience was not the same as weakness. It was the sharpest weapon I had. The man my husband hired to be his lawyer called me on the morning bus, not knowing he had been my family's man for longer than my marriage had existed. Lenora's call the night before had done its job. She would report that I sounded tired, scattered, grateful, everything the plan required. 5 weeks remained. And now, on day 24, the next piece moved across the board. My phone rang at 8:11 a.m. The caller ID read, General Counsel. I was standing between a woman with wet grocery bags and a teenager whose headphones leaked bass. The bus lurched through Atlantic Avenue traffic. I answered. Mrs. Holloway, good morning. The voice was polished, unhurried. This is Frank Stanton. I'm reaching out regarding some estate planning matters your husband asked me to review. Frank Stanton, 58. A New York estate attorney with an impeccable reputation and a client list that included 3 Fortune 500 families. Garrett had hired him 6 months ago to handle what he described as future financial arrangements. What Garrett did not know, what he had never thought to check, was that Frank had been on retainer with Sterling Corporation since 2011. He was Cassandra's appointment. He had been placed in Garrett's path the way you place a mirror in a hallway, so the person walking through sees only themselves, never the person watching from behind the glass. Have you given any thought to future financial arrangements? Frank asked. Your husband mentioned you might be considering some changes to your estate structure. I held the bus pole with one hand and kept my voice light, slightly confused, the tone of a woman who doesn't quite understand legal terminology and isn't sure why a lawyer is calling her on a Tuesday. I don't think so, I said. Garrett handles all of that. I'm just the math teacher. Frank laughed politely. He asked 2 more questions: whether I had met with any financial advisors recently, whether I had discussed inheritance with my father. I answered both with the gentle vagueness of a woman who had been drinking poison tea for 7 months. Then I thanked him and hung up. Garrett had hired a spy and placed him in his own house, except the spy had been living in our house long before Garrett ever arrived, and the house had never been Garrett's to begin with. I called Cassandra before the bus reached Flatbush. He's probing to see if you know anything, Cassandra said. Frank already reported back to me. You're safe. Garrett suspects nothing. How long until he gives Garrett the fake will? About 2 weeks. Frank is drafting it now. When Garrett sees it, he'll believe Alexander has voluntarily transferred majority control of the estate to him through you. He'll stop pushing for the commitment temporarily, because he'll think the money is already moving. And when he realizes it's not real, by then, Cassandra said, we'll have everything we need. 2 days later, on day 26, I sat in my parked Civic in the PS 247 lot during the lunch break and called my father. Alexander Sterling was 78 years old. He had built a real estate empire from a single property in Harlem and turned it into something that shaped the Manhattan skyline. He had also watched with terrible patience as the man his daughter married tried to take it apart from the inside. I hadn't spoken to him directly about the conspiracy until that moment. Part of me had been afraid to, not because I doubted him, because I knew that once I spoke the words aloud to my father, they would become fully real, and the marriage I had believed in would be formally, permanently dead. I know everything, as I said. Silence. Not the silence of surprise. The silence of a man who had been holding his breath for years and was finally allowed to exhale. I've known about Garrett since year 2, he said. His voice was steady, slower than it used to be, but clear. I suspected it before, but you never asked me to interfere in your affairs, and I respect that. My father said, I respect that, the way only a man who has spent decades choosing silence over control can say it with the particular sadness of someone who watched his daughter walk into a trap and held the door open because she had the right to choose her own doors. "Do you know about Mark Beckford?" I asked. A long pause. Through the windshield, I could see the school playground, children running, a teacher blowing a whistle. The ordinary machinery of a world that had nothing to do with mine. "I know about his father," Alexander said. "That's our generation's story, daughter. A land dispute 25 years ago. I won. His family lost everything. The son changed his name and disappeared. Your generation is how you deal with the consequences it leaves behind." "Dad," I gripped the steering wheel. "I need you to be healthy. That's all I need from you right now." "I am healthy," he said. "I've been healthy for a long time. The people who think otherwise are the ones who need me to be weak." We hung up. I sat in the Civic with the engine off and the gray sky pressing down through the windshield. The coffee in my travel mug had gone cold. The car key sat in the ignition unturned. I replayed the segment of the recording I had listened to 14 times now. Garrett's voice, casual, unbothered, the voice of a man discussing logistics rather than violence. "You didn't get it done that time. Don't let it slip up this time." He knew about the car. He knew about the brakes. He had known for 10 years that someone had tried to kill my father, and he had stood at our dinner table and carved the Thanksgiving turkey and asked for seconds and called that man Dad with a smile that never once flickered. I turned the key. The Civic's engine caught on the second try, the familiar reluctance of a car that had carried me through a life I was now dismantling from the inside out. 4 weeks remained. Some vendettas are inherited like eye color. You don't choose them. You simply carry them until they consume everything they touch. I had spent the drive home from PS 247 on day 26 replaying Garrett's words from the recording, letting them settle into the space where trust used to live. By day 28, I was ready for what came next. Not emotionally. I don't think you're ever emotionally ready to learn that the man trying to destroy your family has been building toward it since before you knew his name. Hank's encrypted file arrived during my free period. I read it in the empty teacher's room phone tilted away from the window, the faint smell of whiteboard cleaner hanging in the air. The file was comprehensive. 32 pages. 25 years of history compressed into a document that read like a blueprint for revenge. Mark Beckford's father, his real name was Belford before the son changed. It had been a mid-level real estate developer in Queens in the late 90s. In 1999, he entered a land dispute with Sterling Corporation over a $30 million commercial parcel in Midtown. My father won. The Belford family lost everything. Bankruptcy. Foreclosure. The father died of a heart attack in 2003, 57 years old, in a rented apartment in Georgia, with nothing to his name except a son who had memorized every detail of how the Sterling Empire had taken his family apart. Mark changed his name at 23. He spent the next 15 years building a network of legal contacts, financial operatives, people who could move money through shell companies without leaving fingerprints. He didn't approach Garrett for profit. He approached him because Garrett was already inside the house. Garrett was married to the heir. Garrett was the weapon. And Mark was the hand that aimed it. I set the phone down on the table. Through the window, I could see the playground empty now, the swing still, the asphalt dark with January rain. I thought about Raymond Cole standing on my doorstep 3 weeks ago. Your father saved my life. One man repaying a generational debt with a USB drive. Another man collecting a generational debt with a conspiracy. The debts ran in both directions. They always do. This was no longer a story about a cheating husband or a stolen fortune. This was two families locked in a war that began before I was married, before I was a mother, before I had ever heard the name Holloway. A war that started with a courtroom verdict in 1999 and would end, if I had anything to say about it, in a ballroom in 2025. 3 weeks away. I saved Hank's file in an encrypted folder and went back to teaching. Third period. Negative numbers. The irony was not lost on me. 2 nights later, on day 30, the conspiracy began to eat itself. I was in bed by 10. Garrett was out. He had texted to say he was meeting a client, which meant he was with Diane, who had stopped answering his calls 2 weeks ago, which meant he was somewhere else entirely. Lenora was staying in our guest room for the night, something she did once or twice a month, part of the performance of being my closest friend. Bryce was in his old room down the hall, staying over because the dorm laundry was broken. That was his excuse. I didn't challenge it. What happened next, I learned about 3 weeks later when Bryce finally told me. But I'm telling you now because you need to understand what that night did to him. At 11:40 p.m., Bryce walked down the hallway toward the bathroom. The guest room door was ajar. Lenora's voice came through low, amused, the voice she used when she believed no one was listening. She was on the phone. "That kid is just a puppet," she said. Then she laughed, the short, dismissive laugh of a woman sorting through assets and deciding what to keep. "After it's over, whether he knows anything or not, doesn't matter. Garrett is the same, I'm not sharing it with anyone." What does a 24-year-old boy do when he discovers the people who recruited him consider him garbage? Does he warn his mother? Does he run? Does he stand in a dark hallway with his back against the wall, breathing through his nose, trying to process the fact that the woman sleeping in his stepmother's guest room, the woman who told him this was all for the family's benefit, has just called him disposable? Bryce stood there for almost a minute. Lenora's voice continued lighter now, moving on to something else, laughing about a restaurant reservation already past the sentence that had just rearranged his understanding of his own role in this. He wasn't a partner. He wasn't even a pawn. He was packaging material useful during transit, discarded upon arrival. He went back to his room. He sat on the edge of his bed in the dark. He picked up his phone and scrolled to my name. The screen lit his face, the same face that had laughed on the recording 3 weeks ago, the face I had watched freeze for half a second over dinner when I mentioned Midtown. His thumb hovered over the call button. He didn't press it. I don't know what stopped him. Fear, maybe. Shame. The particular paralysis of a young man who has done something he cannot undo and isn't sure whether confession would save him or finish him. He put the phone on the nightstand, screen down. He pulled the blanket over himself. And through the wall, Lenora's laughter continued, faint, careless. The sound of a woman who had already decided that everyone around her was temporary. Bryce closed his bedroom door from the inside and lay in the dark. He had my number. He had the truth. And he chose silence not because he didn't love me, but because he wasn't yet brave enough to find out if I could still love him back. 3 weeks remained until my birthday. The trap was almost ready, and the people who built it were already turning on each other. I walked into the Sterling building wearing the same cardigan I teach in, and the security guard, who didn't recognize me, was guarding an empire that had my name on the deed. Bryce never called. I learned that, later learned about the hallway, the overheard conversation, the phone screen glowing in the dark with my name on it. But on day 33, all I knew was that the conspiracy was 3 weeks from its deadline, and the people running it were beginning to fracture from the inside. That was enough. Fractures given time become fault lines. Fault lines become collapses. The Sterling Corporation lobby was marble and glass, and the particular hush of a building where the money is old enough to whisper. I hadn't been here in years. I had avoided it deliberately, the same way I avoided my father's world, the same way I drove a Civic and clipped coupons and taught algebra in a public school in Brooklyn. But today, I was not here as a visitor. I was here to pick up a weapon. Cassandra met me at the 38th floor elevator. Her office faced south, the Manhattan skyline stretching to the harbor, January light, sharp against the glass. She closed the door, pulled a document from her desk drawer, and placed it between us. 14 pages. Heavy legal paper. Sterling Corporation watermark. Binding language, signature lines. Witness blocks, notary stamps, everything a valid will should have. It looked real because it was designed to look real by the same legal team that had drafted the actual Sterling estate documents for 30 years. Walk me through it, I said. Cassandra turned to page 11. Clause 4b, she said, tapping the paragraph with her pen. The beneficiary by signing confirms that no pending marital disputes exist, and no ongoing asset disposal attempts are in progress involving any Sterling family member. She looked up. The moment Garrett signs this document, his signature becomes a sworn declaration that he has not been involved in any effort to cease transfer or misappropriate Sterling assets, which of course he has. His signature on this paper is a confession. And if he doesn't read it, he won't, Cassandra said. Greedy people read numbers, not clauses. He'll see the asset figures on page 3 and the beneficiary designation on page 7, and he'll reach for a pen before he gets to page 9. Frank will confirm the document is valid. Garrett will trust Frank. And the trap will close without a sound. Cassandra had built a mousetrap out of legalese and decimal points, the kind of trap that doesn't snap shut when you step on it, but when you sign your name underneath it and smile for the camera. When should I give this to Lenora? I asked. This week. She's been asking about the estate through her visits with your father. She's expecting something. Give her exactly what she expects through a door she thinks only she can open. I took the document. I slid it into the canvas tote bag I carried to school, between a stack of ungraded quizzes and a paperback I'd been reading on the bus. A 14-page bomb sitting next to a 7th grade math test. I thanked Cassandra, rode the elevator back down, and walked out through the lobby past the same security guard who nodded politely at a woman he assumed was someone's assistant. 4 days later, day 37, the Brooklyn Cafe, 2 o'clock. Lenora arrived in a new scarf and fresh lipstick, already scanning my face the way she always did now, checking for symptoms, measuring my decline. I gave her what she needed: tired eyes, slightly scattered speech, a woman who was frightened and didn't know where to turn. My dad sent me something, I said, pulling the document from my bag with hands I let tremble slightly. It's about his will. I don't understand the legal language, and I didn't want to ask Garrett because I don't know. I'm embarrassed. Can you look at it? You're the only person I trust with this. Lenora's expression didn't change, but her pupils did. A dilation so slight that only someone watching for it would notice. She took the document with both hands and opened it right there at the table. I watched her eyes move across those pages the way a hungry person reads a menu, straight to the most expensive items, skipping the fine print about what it actually costs. Page 3, she slowed down. Asset valuations. Her lips parted slightly. Page 7, beneficiary designations. Her fingers tightened on the paper. Page 11, she turned it without stopping. Her eyes were already on page 12, scanning for the signature line. She never read Clause 4b, not a single word. I'll take it home and review it properly, she said, sliding the document into her bag with the careful urgency of a woman who had just been handed the keys to someone else's kingdom. Don't worry about a thing, I'll explain it all to you. Thank you, I said. I let my voice crack. I really don't know what I'd do without you. She squeezed my hand across the table. Then she paid for her coffee, kissed my cheek, and left. I sat alone in the cafe with my cold cup untouched. Through the window, I watched Lenora stop on the sidewalk, pull out her phone and press it to her ear. Her free hand was gesturing quick, excited, the body language of a woman who believed she had just been handed the winning ticket. I couldn't hear the words through the glass, but I didn't need to. She was calling Garrett. She was telling him about the will, about the gala my father supposedly wanted to hold to announce the transfer. And somewhere on page 11, in a clause she would never read, a sentence she would never notice, was already counting down. All it needed now was a signature. And greed, I had learned, always signs. 3 people sat in a lawyer's office celebrating a document designed to destroy them, and the lawyer was the one who had built it. Lenora's call to Garrett had worked exactly as expected. Within 24 hours, the conspirators had gathered not in a back room or a parking garage, but in a legitimate Manhattan law office, because people who believe they are winning stop hiding. That was the point. That had always been the point. I wasn't in that room on day 38. But Cassandra played me the recording that evening, and I know exactly what it looked like. Frank Stanton's office. Mahogany desk, brass lamp leather chairs that cost more than a semester's tuition at the schools where I teach. Garrett sat on the left, jacket off sleeves, rolled the posture of a man who had already won and was simply collecting the paperwork. Lenora sat in the center, legs crossed. The will spread open on her lap like a hymnal she'd been waiting her whole life to read. And on the right, Mark Beckford. Mark Beckford, 51. An investment consultant according to his business card. A man whose real name had been changed twice since a fraud case in Georgia, a man whose patience was indistinguishable from cruelty. I had heard his voice on the recording. I had read Hank's file on his family. But this was the first time I had a clear picture of him in a room with my husband. And the sound of his voice on Cassandra's playback was exactly what I expected. Quiet, controlled the voice of someone who had been planning this longer than Garrett had been married to me. Frank reviewed the will page by page. He turned each sheet with the deliberate care of a man performing a role he had rehearsed. When he reached the final page, he set his pen down and looked across the desk. "This document is 100% valid," he said. "Every clause will hold in court." Satisfied glances around the table. Garrett leaned back. Lenora's lips curved into the small, private smile of a woman who had been rehearsing this moment for years. Mark nodded once, the minimalist approval of a man who trusted process over celebration. "Her birthday," Garrett said. 2 weeks, Plaza Hotel. "Make it public," Mark said. "Press livestream everything. The transfer needs witnesses. 300 minimum." Lenora folded her hands on the document. "She won't suspect a thing. She thinks I'm reviewing it as a favor. I wasn't in that room. But I know exactly what it looked like, 3 people dividing a fortune that didn't belong to them, toasting with the confidence of thieves who had never been caught, while the man sitting behind the desk was writing down every word for the woman they planned to rob." Frank sent the recording to Cassandra within the hour. By evening, it was in my encrypted folder alongside the pastor's tape, the surveillance photos, Dr. Prescott's transcripts, and Hank's file on the Beckford family history. The evidence was building the way a river builds behind a dam, silently, steadily waiting for the moment someone opens the gates. 2 days later, day 40, the Brooklyn Cafe, my usual table near the back window. Hank arrived with a new folder. Thinner than the last one, but heavier in what it meant. He slid it across the table and waited while I opened it. Bank statements. A savings account opened 6 weeks ago under the name Sarah Alexander, the same alias Lenora used when visiting my father. Small deposits, 2,000 here, 3,500 there. Consistent, careful, building. "She's siphoning," Hank said, "from the money Garrett gives her through the joint account supplements. She's not putting it aside for the operation. She's building a runway." Is there anything more predictable than a conspiracy built on greed collapsing because of greed? They couldn't even rob me without robbing each other first. Lenora had looked Garrett in the eye in Frank's office 2 days ago and smiled about their shared victory, and the entire time she had been funneling his money into an escape fund he knew nothing about. She wasn't planning to split the fortune. She was planning to take it and vanish the same way she had vanished Eleanor Marsh, the same way she had planned to vanish me. Garrett was a tool. Mark was a tool. Everyone was temporary except Lenora. "Nobody in that alliance trusts anyone," Hank said. He picked up his coffee, the only one of us who ever actually drank it at these meetings. "You almost don't need to do anything." "Almost," I said. Almost was the operative word. The alliance was rotting from within, yes. Lenora would betray Garrett eventually, and Garrett would discover it eventually, and Mark would cut his losses eventually. But eventually was not precise enough. I needed it to happen on my terms at my time in front of 300 witnesses and a live stream camera. I needed the collapse to be public documented. And irreversible, because private collapses get cleaned up. Private betrayals get settled out of court, and I had not spent 40 days drinking poison tea and performing my own deterioration to settle anything out of court. I closed the folder and looked out the cafe window. Manhattan lights were coming on in the early dusk, the buildings turning from gray to gold the way they do in winter when the sun drops fast. Those two would turn on each other before I needed to lift a finger. Lenora was already halfway out the door with the money, and Garrett didn't know he was standing alone. But the gala was still 2 weeks away, and there was one more person I needed to find before the curtain went up. A woman who had been declared dead 6 years ago in a facility that no longer existed, whose body had never been recovered, whose name I had been carrying in my head since Hank first placed her photograph on this same cafe table. Eleanor Marsh. If she was alive, she was the final piece, and I was running out of days to find her. Hank called me at 3:47 on a Tuesday afternoon and said 5 words that changed the entire case. Eleanor Marsh is alive. I was sitting in the Civic in the PS 247 parking lot, engine off, watching the last of the after-school buses pull away. The chain-link fence rattled in the wind. Beyond it, the playground was empty swings, still asphalt dark with old rain. I gripped the steering wheel with my free hand and listened. Small town outside Montpelier. Hank said, his voice crackling through the car speaker. Elementary school teacher. She's been hiding for 5 years under a different name. A nurse at the psychiatric facility helped her disappear before Beckford could finish the job. Eleanor Marsh. The woman in the intake photograph. The woman whose death certificate had no body attached to it, whose estate had been liquidated through a Delaware shell company, whose file I had carried in my bag for 5 weeks. She was 44 years old now, teaching children in Vermont the same way I taught children in Brooklyn, under a name that was not hers, in a life she had not chosen. Because a man she trusted had tried to erase her. I asked Hank for the number. He gave it to me. I sat in the parking lot for 3 minutes, watching my breath fog the windshield before I dialed. The phone rang 4 times. When she answered, her voice was small, cautious. The voice of a woman who had spent 5 years not answering phones from unknown numbers. My name is Kwasia Sterling, I said. I know what happened to you, and I know who did it. I need your help. Silence. Not the silence of confusion. The silence of recognition, the sound a person makes when a door they stop believing in suddenly opens. I've been waiting for this call for 5 years, she said. Eleanor Marsh had been a name in a detective's file, a photograph of a woman declared dead. And then she was a voice on the phone, fragile and real and alive, and I understood for the first time that what I was fighting wasn't just my battle. It was hers too. It had been hers first. She had walked into the same trap I was standing in, except nobody had handed her a USB drive at 6:47 in the morning. Nobody had warned her. She had gone in blind and come out broken and spent 5 years teaching other people's children in a town where nobody knew her real name because the alternative was being found by a man who had already tried to kill her once. We talked for 11 minutes. I told her about the recording, the gala, the fake will. She told me about the facility, the room, the dosage, the nurse named Caldwell, who unlocked a service door at 2 a.m. and drove her to a bus station in Albany. She told me she had testified in her head 1,000 times. She told me she was ready. I'll send someone to bring you to New York, I said. You'll be safe. I promise you that. I stopped believing in promises 5 years ago, Eleanor said. Then quieter. But I believe in patterns, and yours sounds like mine, so I'll come. 2 days later, day 44, the Manhattan Ledger office's 22nd floor. The newsroom was glass walls and city views, and the steady percussion of keyboards. Layout proofs covered every surface. The air smelled like printer ink, and the kind of strong coffee that journalists drink because sleep is optional. I was escorted to a corner office by an assistant who didn't ask my name. Vivian Cho stood up from behind her desk when I walked in. 38 years old, editor-in-chief of the Manhattan Ledger, sharp-eyed, direct, the kind of woman who shook your hand like she was already deciding whether to trust you. She was the journalist Garrett had tried to weaponize against me, and she was already preparing the article that would end him. They came to me 2 weeks ago. Vivian said, sitting back down and gesturing for me to do the same. Your husband and a woman named Voss. They had a story about the sterling heir losing her mind. Emotional instability. Erratic behavior. They wanted me to run it before the gala. Why didn't you? Because I'd sat across from your father 6 months ago for a profile piece, and that man did not look worried about his daughter. She opened a folder on her desk. He looked like a man who was waiting for something. I couldn't figure out what. Now I think I know. Garrett had handed Vivian a loaded gun and asked her to point it at me, not knowing she had already decided to turn it around and hand it back. I'm preparing a different article, Vivian said. The real one. Financial fraud, forged estate documents, attempted psychiatric commitment. If you want to tell the true story, I'm listening. I'll give you the story, I said, but you have to wait for the right time. She studied me for a moment. When? I'll text you, you'll know. Vivian nodded. She didn't push. She didn't negotiate. She understood timing the way journalists understand timing, not as patience but as precision, the difference between a story that lands and a story that detonates. I left the Ledger building and stood on the sidewalk in the late afternoon cold. February air. 2 weeks gone since I first walked into this fight. 12 days remaining until the gala. Eleanor Marsh in Vermont. Vivienne Cho on the 22nd floor. Diane Mercer in Midtown. Cassandra on the 38th floor. Dr. Prescott on the Upper East Side. Hank in every shadow. Frank in the enemy's office. Every woman in this story was now in position. Every man I trusted was ready. I took out my phone and texted Cassandra 2 words. We're ready. The wind picked up on Fifth Avenue. I pulled my coat tighter, the same wool coat, the same fraying cuff, and walked toward the subway. 12 days. The gala was 12 days away, and every piece was on the board. Diane Mercer opened her apartment door and looked at me the way soldiers look at each other before a battle they both know is coming. 12 days had passed since I texted Cassandra. Every piece was in position. Eleanor was traveling from Vermont. Vivienne was waiting for the signal. Frank was inside the enemy's camp. Now I needed the last person, the one whose role could not be rehearsed, only chosen. Diane's apartment was small and clean. A laptop glowed on the kitchen table beside a printed layout of the Plaza Hotel ballroom floor plan exit routes table assignments. I had sent it the day before. She had already marked it up in red pen. Sit down, she said. Tell me what you need. I walked her through the logistics. Stand beside Alexander when Garrett enters. Be visible. Be calm. Let the room see you and understand what your presence means. Diane listened with her arms crossed, nodding at each point, asking precise questions. Where would the cameras be? When would the recording play? How many officers would Hank have at the exits? Then she uncrossed her arms. I want to speak, she said. You don't have to. I know I don't have to. That's why I want to. She looked at me with the steadiness of a woman who had spent 2 months rebuilding something she hadn't known was broken. Not because you need me to. Because I need to speak for myself. I need him to hear my voice and know that the woman he told had nothing without him has plenty. Then speak, I said. No one will stop you. We went over the timeline once more. She walked me to the door. The hallway was quiet, the particular silence of an apartment building at night, pipes ticking, someone's television murmuring through the wall. She shook my hand. Her grip was firm, but her fingers were trembling. Are you scared? She asked. No, I said. I'm scared, she said, but I'll come. 2 women standing in a doorway in Midtown, one scared, and one, not both, deciding to walk into the same fire for entirely different reasons. That is the closest thing to sisterhood I have ever experienced with someone I met, because my husband lied to us both. Before I tell you what happened on the night before the gala, are you still with me? Because this is where everything turns. Comment your prediction in 1 sentence. Do you think Bryce warned his father or stayed silent? Please note what follows contains some dramatized details for narrative impact. The message behind it is what matters most. 2 days later, day 48. The night before everything. I was sitting at the kitchen table at 11:30 grading papers I would never return. The apartment was dark except for the overhead light above the table. Garrett was upstairs already asleep. The kitchen camera watched from its cabinet corner. I sat within its frame deliberately performing the last evening of a woman who suspected nothing. The hallway floor creaked. Bryce appeared in the doorway. He was wearing a t-shirt and sweatpants, his hair uncombed, his phone in his right hand. He stood there for a long moment, then pulled out a chair and sat across from me. He didn't speak right away. He looked at the papers spread across the table. He looked at my hand steady holding a red pen. He looked at my face. Then he said it. "Mom knows everything, doesn't she?" I set the pen down. I folded my hands on the table. I looked at my stepson, 24 years old, his father's jaw, his father's smile, and something behind his eyes that his father had never had. Fear. Real fear. Not of being caught. Of being known. "What will you do to me?" he asked. My son sat across from me in the kitchen and asked what I would do to him, and I realized with a clarity that hurt more than anything on that recording he wasn't asking because he was sorry. He was asking because he wanted to know his odds. "That's my decision," I said. "Not yours. Go to sleep." He sat there for another 5 seconds. His thumb moved on his phone, scrolling to something, or scrolling away from something I couldn't tell. Then he pushed back from the table, stood up, and walked down the hallway without another word. His bedroom door closed. The apartment went silent. I sat at the table for 10 more minutes. I capped the red pen. I stacked the papers. I turned off the kitchen light and walked upstairs in the dark, past the guest room where Lenora had laughed on the phone 3 weeks ago, past the bathroom where I had read Hank's first message with the faucet running, past the hallway where my son had stood frozen in the dark and chosen not to call me. Garrett was sleeping soundly. His breathing was slow, and even the deep, unbothered rhythm of a man who believed tomorrow was his victory. I slid into bed beside him. His body heat pressed against the sheets. I stared at the ceiling. 6 hours until morning. 14 hours until the Plaza Hotel lobby filled with 300 guests. Somewhere in Vermont, Eleanor Marsh was packing a bag. Somewhere in Midtown, Diane Mercer was trying on the emerald dress she would wear tomorrow. Somewhere on the 22nd floor of the Ledger building, Vivienne Cho was finishing the article that would run the moment I sent 2 words. Garrett shifted in his sleep. His hand brushed mine under the blanket, an unconscious gesture, the muscle memory of a husband reaching for his wife in the dark. I didn't move. I didn't pull away. I let his hand rest against mine and thought a single sentence. Tomorrow morning. The last 9 years of my life would end in a single evening, and the man lying beside me. He was making me eggs on the morning he planned to take everything I had, and the yolks were perfect. I woke to the smell of frying oil and toast. February light came through the bedroom window, thin, pale, the kind of winter morning light that makes everything look like a photograph that hasn't been developed yet. The bed beside me was empty. Garrett was already downstairs. I could hear him humming. I lay there for 30 seconds. The ceiling I had stared at the night before stared back. Then I got up, washed my face, put on the cardigan, and walked into the kitchen to accept my birthday breakfast from a man who had spent 9 years rehearsing this exact morning. The kitchen was warm. Eggs in the pan, toast on the counter, coffee already poured. A small wrapped gift sat beside my mug, silver paper white ribbon, the kind of wrapping that requires either genuine care or deliberate performance. With Garrett, I could no longer tell the difference. I wasn't sure there had ever been one. "Happy birthday, darling," he said, sliding the eggs onto a plate with the spatula. He set the plate in front of me and kissed my cheek dry and light, the practiced kiss of a man who has been applying the same gesture to the same spot for nearly a decade. I made a reservation for tonight. Just the 2 of us first, then the party. The party. The gala. 300 guests at the Plaza Hotel where my husband planned to announce the transfer of the Sterling estate in front of press cameras, and a live stream audience using a document that would incriminate him the moment he signed it. He was smiling at me across the kitchen counter, pouring himself more coffee. And in his mind, this was the last morning he would ever need to pretend. In mine, too. "You're so thoughtful," I said. He leaned against the counter with his mug, watching me eat. His cologne was the same one he always wore, woody, warm, the scent I had once found comforting, and now recognized as costume. He looked handsome. He looked kind. He looked like a man who loved his wife. "I want to tell you what it feels like to sit across from a man who is cooking your last meal as his wife, and not know whether the eggs or the marriage is the bigger performance, because both are done with the same careful, practiced hands. He seasoned the eggs the way I liked them. He remembered that I take my toast with butter, not jam. He placed the coffee at my right hand because he knew I was right-handed. 9 years of observation deployed in a single breakfast. Was it love? Was it surveillance? I had stopped trying to separate the two. I ate. The eggs were good, or they were nothing. I couldn't tell you afterward whether they had flavor. My mouth performed chewing and swallowing the way my voice performed gratitude, the way my face performed surprise at the small wrapped gift I picked up and held but did not open. "I'll open it tonight," I said. "After dinner. I want to savor it." Garrett smiled. "I'll hold you to that." He finished his coffee. He checked his phone, 3 messages he read without showing me the screen, the quick thumb scroll of a man managing multiple lives. He put on his jacket, picked up his gym bag, and walked to the front door. At the door, he turned. "I love you," he said, casually, over his shoulder. The way he always said it, as a reflex, a bookmark, a sound he made on his way out of rooms. "Me too," I said. He said, "I love you," the way he always said it, and I said it back the way I had said it for 9 years. The only difference was that this time, for the first time, we were both lying. He was lying because he had never meant it. I was lying because I no longer needed to. The words sat in the air between us like a contract both parties knew had expired, signed in ink that had already faded. The door closed. His footsteps went down the stairs. I walked to the kitchen window and watched his shadow move along the sidewalk, confident stride, phone already at his ear, gym bag over one shoulder. He turned the corner and disappeared. The last time I would watch my husband leave this apartment as a free man. The kitchen was quiet. His coffee cup sat on the counter, half empty. The gift sat beside it, still wrapped, the silver paper catching the winter light. I didn't touch it. I didn't need to know what was inside. Whatever it was, jewelry, a scarf, something chosen to reinforce the illusion of a man who noticed and cared. It belonged to a marriage that had ended 49 days ago on a Tuesday morning when a stranger rang the doorbell. I picked up my phone. The apartment was silent. The camera in the cabinet corner watched me. I let it. There was nothing left to perform. No more poisoned tea to drink, no more breakdowns to stage. No more conversations to calibrate. The woman standing in this kitchen was not the woman Garrett had married, not the woman Lenora had groomed, not the woman Mark Beckford had been monitoring through 3 hidden cameras. That woman was gone. She had served her purpose. I typed 6 words and sent them to Vivian Cho. "Tonight, Plaza Hotel, 8 p.m. She read the message in under a minute. No reply came back. She didn't need to reply. The article was written. The evidence was compiled. Eleanor Marsh was on a bus from Vermont. Diane Mercer was in Midtown pressing the emerald dress she would wear tonight. Hank had officers positioned. Cassandra had the documents ready. Raymond Cole was waiting. I set the phone on the counter beside Garrett's empty cup. I looked at the eggs still sitting in the pan, perfectly cooked, growing cold. Then I turned off the stove and went upstairs to choose what I would wear to the end of my marriage. 300 people filled the Plaza Hotel ballroom that evening, and not one of them knew they were attending a funeral. I chose the black blazer. Cotton, not silk. A white shirt beneath it buttoned to the collar. Flat shoes. No jewelry. In a room that would be filled with sequined gowns and tailored suits and watches that cost more than a year of my teaching salary, I wanted to look like exactly what I was, a woman who had come to work. At 7:45 p.m., the ballroom was already full. I wasn't there yet. I was watching from a service corridor on the east side of the building, my phone open to a group thread with Cassandra, Hank, and Vivian. The updates came in quietly. Hank officers at 3 exits. Cassandra documents with Frank. Vivian article queued livestream crew in position. Mark Beckford, who had crossed from the coat check to the AV booth 12 minutes earlier, sent one word, ready. Through a crack in the corridor door, I could see the lobby. Garrett stood at the ballroom entrance in a custom navy suit, shaking hands, radiating ownership. Lenora was at his elbow in a silver dress, steering conversations, touching arms, laughing at the right moments, ensuring the narrative. This was Garrett's company now. This was his night. At 7:52, the lobby doors opened and the room changed. My father walked in. Alexander Sterling, 78 years old, uninvited, unannounced, wearing a simple gray suit that hung looser than it had a year ago. He moved slowly but steadily, the way a man moves when he knows the room is watching and wants them to see that he is not afraid. Beside him, Diane Mercer in an emerald dress, her hand on his arm, her chin level. Her eyes finding Lenora's across the lobby with the precision of a woman who had rehearsed this moment in her mirror. The conversation died in expanding ripples. Garrett's champagne glass stopped halfway to his mouth. Lenora's smile froze. My father did nothing theatrical. He nodded at 2 board members by name. He shook a hand. He walked past Garrett without a word, without even a glance, and continued into the ballroom as if he had been attending these galas for decades, which he had. What the hell is he doing here? Garrett whispered to Lenora, his smile locked in place. Smile, she said, gripping his wrist. Everyone is watching. Diane paused beside Lenora for exactly 2 seconds. Lenora, she said, you look well. Then she followed my father into the ballroom, her heels clicking on the marble like a metronome, counting down to something only she and I could hear. I stood in the corridor and touched the wall. The last time I had been in this building, I was 12. My parents' anniversary party. My mother was alive. My father was laughing, the full, unguarded laugh of a man who hadn't yet learned what it cost to trust the wrong people. I had worn a blue dress and sat at a table too big for me and eaten cake with my fingers when no one was looking. That girl had no idea what this building would become. Neither did the woman standing here now, except that the woman had a plan and the girl had only had cake. I walked in at 8 p.m. Not through the main entrance, through the side corridor directly onto the ballroom floor. I crossed the room without stopping, without greeting anyone, without making eye contact with Garrett or Lenora or any of the 300 faces turning to watch the woman in the cotton blazer who looked like she had wandered in from a different event. I sat down at table 14. The table Garrett's seating chart had left empty. My father placed one hand over mine. His skin was papery, warm, trembling slightly, the hand of a man who hadn't attended a public event in 14 months. He held it there for 3 seconds. Then he removed it. You look like your mother tonight, he said quietly. I know, I said. I opened my phone, checked the sequence file every minute from 8:05 to 8:30, mapped and assigned, then closed it. Across the room, Mark Beckford settled into the AV booth beside the LED screen that Garrett had set up for his own presentation. The screen that in 4 minutes would show something very different from what Garrett had planned. At 8:03, Garrett straightened his tie. I watched his hands, confident, steady, adjusting cufflinks that were monogrammed G.H., not S.H., not Sterling Holloway. Just his own initials, as if the Sterling name had already been erased from everything it touched. A small detail. The kind of detail that a man who believed he had already won would not think to hide. The kind of detail that confirmed everything I had spent 49 days building toward. He took a final sip of bourbon, set the glass on the edge of the stage, and walked toward the raised platform at the front of the ballroom. He picked up the microphone. He tapped it twice, a feedback whine cutting through the room like a siren pitched too high to register as warning. Then he spread his arms wide and smiled at 300 faces. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said. He had no idea. He had no idea that in exactly 4 minutes, the man sitting at table 14, the father-in-law he had tried to have killed, the billionaire he had tried to rob, the old man in the gray suit who had walked past him without a word, would rise from his chair and ask a single question. A question that would end Garrett's career, his marriage, and his freedom. All before the first course was served. Garrett said the word "will," and my father stood up. It happened the way I had planned it, and still it felt like watching a building collapse in slow motion. Garrett had been speaking for 2 minutes, thanking the guests, praising the legacy of Sterling Corporation building toward the announcement he believed would crown him. His voice was smooth, confident, the voice of a man standing on a stage he thought belonged to him. "And so tonight," he said, leaning into the microphone with the ease of a man delivering good news, "I am honored to announce that Quasia Sterling has voluntarily transferred her inheritance rights per the valid will of Alexander Sterling." 300 people applauded politely. Some raised glasses. A board member near the front nodded. And then my father rose from table 14. He didn't rush. He didn't shout. He stood the way a man stands when he has been sitting for a long time and wants the room to understand that standing is a choice, not a reaction. He straightened his gray jacket. He picked up the second microphone from the table placed there hours earlier by Mark Beckford, who had thought of everything, and he walked towards the stage. The applause died. Garrett saw him coming. I watched the sequence cross my husband's face in real-time surprise confusion, the flicker of calculation, and then something I had never seen on Garrett Holloway's face before. Fear. My father stepped onto the platform. He did not look at Garrett. He looked at the room. 300 faces. Investors, board members, city officials, journalists. Every person Garrett had invited to witness his coronation was now watching a 78-year-old man in a loose gray suit take the stage uninvited. Alexander raised the microphone. "You mentioned the valid will of Alexander Sterling," he said. His voice was steady. Slower than it used to be, but clear, the clarity of a man who had spent 14 months in quiet rooms preparing for exactly this sentence. "But I, Alexander Sterling, am standing here, alive, healthy. So whose will is that?" 6 seconds of silence. I counted them. 6 seconds of dead air through a live microphone amplified through a ballroom sound system heard by 300 people who were suddenly very still. Garrett's mouth opened. His lips moved. Nothing came out. The bourbon on his breath caught the stage lights as he exhaled. I could see the faint mist of it from table 14. My father did not wait for an answer. He didn't need one. The question was not a question. It was a detonation. Every person in that room understood in the same instant that the will Garrett had just announced was either forged or fraudulent, because the man whose death it required was standing 6 feet away from him, breathing, blinking, and holding a microphone. Then the screen changed. The LED display behind the stage, the one Garrett had set up for his own presentation, his own family photos, his own corporate timeline switched. The warm images of Sterling Corporation milestones disappeared. In their place, black text on white background. A headline from the Manhattan Ledger published 30 seconds earlier, already live on every phone in the room. "The Sterling Conspiracy. 300 phones came out of 300 pockets at once." The room filled with the blue glow of screens and the low murmur of people reading the same words simultaneously. Vivienne Cho was somewhere in the back. Phone pressed to her ear, her voice barely audible above the noise. "We're live. 18,000 viewers and climbing." Then the recording played. Mark Beckford from the AV booth pressed a single button. The ballroom speakers, the same speakers that had carried Garrett's confident voice moments ago, now carried a different version of that voice. Recorded, flat, clinical. The voice I had first heard on a USB drive 49 days ago in my Brooklyn kitchen. Garrett's voice filled the Plaza Hotel ballroom, and this time 300 people heard what I had heard alone. The will is airtight. She won't contest it. She doesn't have the spine. A gasp moved through the room like wind through leaves. Garrett stepped backward on the stage. His hand reached for the podium, missed it, found it on the second try. I watched my husband's face as his own voice called me spineless in front of every person he had ever tried to impress, and I felt nothing. Not rage, not satisfaction. Just the clean, cold click of a lock turning shut. The recording continued. Voices layered over each other, Garrett, then Beckford discussing timelines. Then a laugh I recognized as Bryce's. Then the clinical planning of a psychiatric commitment designed to look like compassion. The room listened. Nobody moved. Nobody left. They couldn't. They were watching a man's life unravel in real time. And the human instinct to witness destruction is stronger than the instinct to look away. Then Lenora's voice came through the speakers. Clear, unhurried. The warm, careful voice I had heard on Sunday phone calls and at brunch tables, and in the quiet moments when I had believed she was the closest friend I would ever have. And if the old man talks, she said on the recording. A pause. Then, I'll send him to a mental institution. I know people. The words hung in the ballroom air. 300 people heard a woman discuss putting a 78-year-old man in a locked facility to steal his family's empire, and the silence that followed was not the silence of shock. It was the silence of verdict. Every person in that room had already decided. I pressed my fingers flat against the tablecloth. Steady, unmoving. Beside me, my father sat down, slowly placed the microphone on the table, and folded his hands. He had said all he needed to say. Across the ballroom, Lenora Voss pushed back from her chair. She stood. She turned toward the stage and looked directly at Garrett, not with fear, not with shame, but with the cold, calculating gaze of a woman who had already decided that the man standing under those lights was no longer useful to her. Lenora took the stage like a woman walking into her own sentencing, except she brought the evidence against someone else. She moved before Garrett could recover. While he stood under the lights with his mouth still open and 300 faces staring up at him, Lenora walked to the platform, climbed the 2 steps, and took the microphone from his hand. He didn't resist. His fingers opened like a man releasing something he had already lost. She turned to face the room. Her silver dress caught the stage lights. Her face was composed, not the composure of innocence, but the composure of a woman who had run the numbers and decided that the fastest way out of a burning building was to set fire to the person standing next to her. "You promised me," she said into the microphone, looking directly at Garrett. Her voice was clear, steady, projected. "You said you would protect me. You said we were partners." She held up her phone. The screen glowed white against the dim ballroom lighting. A thread of text messages scrolled to the top. "These are the texts you sent me when I tried to leave the arrangement 6 months ago," she said. She read the first one aloud. A threat. Specific, detailed, unmistakable. She read the second worse. The third was the kind of message that makes a courtroom go quiet and a jury stop breathing. Then she turned and handed the phone to the uniformed officer standing at the ballroom entrance. Hank had positioned him there an hour ago. Garrett stared at her, not with anger, with the particular blankness of a man watching the last wall collapse. "Lenora," he said. His voice came through the speakers, thin, stripped of its earlier confidence. "Don't do this. Not here. You taught me that survival is a solo act, Garrett," she said. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "I learned from the best." She set the microphone on the podium, turned her back to him, and walked off the stage. 300 people watched her cross the ballroom floor, heels clicking chin level. the measured walk of a woman who had just publicly executed her partner and was heading for the door as though she had somewhere better to be. Garrett stood on that stage the way a building stands after the foundation has been pulled still upright, but only because nobody had pushed yet. His hands hung at his sides. The LED screen behind him still showed the Ledger headline. The recording had stopped, but his voice lingered in the room like smoke after a fire. 300 people looked up at a man who had nothing left to say, and not one of them looked away. I didn't watch Lenora leave. I was watching something else. At the back of the ballroom near the AV booth, a figure was moving. Mark Beckford. He had waited until every eye in the room was on the stage, and then he slipped from behind the projector screen and moved toward the side corridor, the service exit that led to the hotel's loading dock, and from there to the street. He walked quickly. Not running draws attention, but quickly enough that I knew he had planned this exit before the evening began. A man like Beckford always has an exit. That was what made him dangerous. That was what made what happened next so satisfying. He reached the corridor. The door was 10 feet ahead. Cold air was already seeping through the gap beneath it, industrial cleaner and winter, and the metallic smell of a loading dock in February. Freedom was 10 feet away. Raymond Cole was standing in front of it, hands in his pockets, thumbs hooked on the lining. 63 years old, the same worn jacket, the same weathered hands I had seen on my doorstep 49 mornings ago. He stood in the doorway the way a wall stands, without effort, without intention, simply there. Raymond didn't speak. He didn't need to. Some men carry authority in their voice. Raymond carried it in the silence where his voice should have been. He looked at Mark Beckford with the patient, unhurried gaze of a man who had been waiting for this moment far longer than 49 days. Behind Raymond, Hank Rawlings stepped into view. 3 uniformed officers behind him. The corridor suddenly felt very small. "Move," Mark said. His voice was tight, controlled. The voice of a man who still believed he could negotiate his way through a locked door. "This has nothing to do with you." Raymond shook his head. Once, slowly. Mark stopped. 3 feet from the exit. Close enough to feel the cold air. Close enough to see Raymond's face clearly under the corridor's fluorescent light. And then something changed. Mark's expression shifted, not the panic of a man being caught, but the recognition of a man seeing something he had believed was buried. His eyes moved across Raymond's face the way you read a document you haven't seen in decades. The jaw, the eyes, the particular way Raymond held his shoulders. "You," Mark said, not a greeting, not a question. A word pulled from somewhere deep and involuntary, the kind of word that escapes before the mind can stop it. He knew Raymond. Not from tonight, not from this conspiracy, from something older, something generational, something that connected the Beckford name to a debt that ran deeper than money. The color left Mark's face. His hands, which had been steady through every phase of a conspiracy spanning years, began to tremble. "Mark Beckford," Hank said from behind Raymond's shoulder. "Stay where you are." Mark didn't move. Not because Hank told him to stay, because his legs had stopped working. He stood in that corridor staring at Raymond Cole, the man my father had saved at a prison gate 31 years ago, and for the first time in this entire story, the broker who had perfected the art of destroying women and disappearing was the one who was afraid. Nobody asked Diane Mercer to speak, and that was exactly why every person in that ballroom needed to hear her. In the service corridor, Hank's officers had Mark Beckford against the wall. Raymond Cole stood 3 feet away, hands still in his pockets, watching with the patience of a man who had waited 31 years for this hallway. Back in the ballroom, Garrett remained on stage alone now, Lenora gone, the microphone lying on the podium where she had left it. He looked like a man standing in the wreckage of a house he had built on someone else's land. Then Diane stood up from table 14. She walked toward the stage without hesitation. Her emerald dress moved under the chandeliers, the only color left in a room that had gone gray with shock. She climbed the 2 steps, picked up the microphone Garrett had dropped, and turned to face the cameras. Garrett saw her. His face went through one final sequence recognition confusion, and then the flat emptiness of a man who understood that the last person he had lied to had just walked onto his stage. "My name is Diane Mercer," she said. Her voice was steady, not performed steady, genuinely steady, the steadiness of a woman who had spent 2 months deciding exactly what she would say and how she would say it. "I loved this man for 2 years. I didn't know he was married. I didn't know about his wife, his family, or the life he was dismantling while he held my hand and told me I was the only person who mattered to him." She paused. The ballroom was silent. Not the hostile silence of judgment, but the held breath silence of 300 people watching someone do the hardest thing they had ever seen done in public. "I'm here because the woman he easily fooled is the last woman he wants to see," Diane said. Then she turned not to Garrett but to me, across the ballroom. Her eyes found mine at table 14, and she spoke directly to me into the microphone in front of every camera and every guest and the live stream that was still running. "I owe you nothing," she said, "but I owe myself this." I looked at Diane Mercer standing on that stage in the emerald dress she had pressed in her Midtown apartment 2 nights ago. The dress she had been scared to wear, the dress she had chosen anyway, and I understood that this moment had nothing to do with me. It had nothing to do with the empire or the conspiracy, or the billions of dollars that had brought us all to this room. This was a woman reclaiming her voice from a man who had told her she had nothing without him. And she was doing it on his stage under his lights in front of his guests. "I know," I said, quietly, from my seat. She heard me. She nodded once. I nodded back. I had imagined this moment for 49 days, Garrett in handcuffs, the empire returned, justice served, and none of it felt the way I thought it would. The satisfaction I had expected was absent. In its place was something quieter and heavier, the weight of knowing that winning doesn't undo the wound. It just stops the bleeding. Diane set the microphone on the podium and walked off the stage. 2 officers approached Garrett. He didn't resist. He extended his wrists with the mechanical compliance of a man whose body had accepted what his mind had not yet processed. The click of handcuffs echoed through the emptying ballroom, a small metallic sound that carried farther than it should have. They led him out through the service corridor. I didn't watch. I had spent 49 days watching Garrett Holloway. I was finished. The ballroom emptied slowly. Guests filed out in small groups, speaking in low voices, phones glowing. Vivienne's crew packed their equipment. The LED screen went dark. The chandeliers dimmed on a timer section by section, as if the building itself was closing the curtain. My father stood beside me near the stage. The ballroom was nearly empty now, a few waitstaff collecting champagne flutes, a security guard by the main door, the 2 of us standing in the quiet aftermath of something that had taken 49 days to build and 12 minutes to detonate. He placed his hand on my shoulder. Heavier than I expected, steadier than I remembered. His wool suit smelled like mothballs and cedar, the scent of a closet opened after 14 months of deliberate isolation of a man who had stayed away, not because he was weak, but because he was waiting. When does a daughter stop protecting her father? When he tells her to, or when she finally believes he doesn't need it? "I don't need your protection," he said. "I never have." I looked at him, 78 years old, thinner than he used to be. But his eyes were the same clear, sharp, the eyes of a man who had built an empire from nothing and watched someone try to steal it and never once panicked. His frailty had been real, but it had also been useful. Garrett had seen a dying old man. My father had let him. "You don't know that," I said. "I do," he said. "But I appreciate that you don't believe me." My eyes burned. For the first time in 49 days, I let them. Salt reached my lips before I wiped my face with the back of my hand. Not many tears. Not the kind that shakes your body. The quiet kind, the kind that comes when the fight is over and your hands finally stop gripping. A journalist approached, young notebook out recorder raised. Mrs. Holloway, any comment on tonight's events? I wiped my eyes. I looked at the journalist and gave the only answer that mattered. No statement, your article said enough. My phone buzzed in my pocket. One message from Vivienne. The article broke 2 million views, but there's something in the recording we missed. Minute 34. Call me tonight. Minute 34 was not about money. It was about a body that was supposed to stop breathing 10 years ago. I called Vivian that night from the kitchen table. She played the segment over the phone. I heard it clearly, Garrett's voice casual, embedded in a conversation about timelines that I had listened to 14 times without catching it. But Vivian's audio team had isolated the frequencies and cleaned the background noise, and now the words were unmistakable. 3 days later, I sat across from Hank in a precinct on the west side of Manhattan. The fluorescent lights flattened everything: faces, furniture, the gray walls, the gray coffee, the gray weight of what we were about to hear. Hank pressed play on the cleaned audio. Garrett's voice came through the precinct speakers, tinny and distorted, but unmistakably his. You didn't get it done that time. Don't let it slip this time. That time. 10 years ago. The car. The brakes. My father on a road in Connecticut, driving home from a board meeting, the steering pulling left, and the brakes gone, and the car hitting a guardrail at 60 miles an hour. He had survived because the guardrail held. The police report called it mechanical failure. The insurance company called it an accident. And Garrett, sitting at our dinner table 2 years later, carving turkey, calling my father Dad, had known the entire time that it was neither. This isn't fraud anymore, Hank said. He closed the laptop. His voice was quiet, the particular quiet of a detective who has seen enough cases turn from financial to violent and knows exactly what happens next. This is attempted murder, and your husband knew. How long have you suspected? I asked. Since the recording, but now we can prove it. Garrett was formally charged with conspiracy to commit murder 3 days later. The financial crimes were still on the docket: the forged will, the asset seizure, the drugging, but they had become supporting evidence for something that would put him away for decades, not years. On day 58, Eleanor Marsh walked into a Manhattan courtroom. Eleanor Marsh was supposed to be dead. Mark Beckford had made sure of it 6 years ago: the psychiatric commitment, the dosage, the facility that closed 18 months later with no transfer records. He had built her disappearance the way he built everything: methodically, patiently, without loose ends. And until she walked through that courtroom door, he believed he had succeeded. She took the witness stand. 44 years old, thin-faced, steady-eyed, wearing a gray blazer she had probably bought for this occasion. She looked at Mark Beckford across the courtroom, and he looked back, and the color drained from his face the way color drains from a photograph left too long in the sun. He used the same method, Eleanor said. Her voice was calm. The calm of a woman who had testified in her head 1,000 times in a small Vermont apartment and was now finally saying the words out loud. Same dosage, same timeline, same psychiatric facility. I survived because my housekeeper came home early. Mark's attorney stood. Ms. Marsh, you've been in hiding for 6 years. Why come forward now? Eleanor looked at me. Across the courtroom, past the attorneys and the stenographer and the judge. She looked at me the way one survivor looks at another, not with gratitude, not with pity, but with the simple recognition of a woman who understood what it cost to be in this room. Because someone finally asked, she said. Mark was convicted of attempted murder with premeditation. His attorney filed for appeal. It would be denied. 2 days later, day 60. The precinct again. Different room. I stood behind one-way glass and watched my stepson negotiate his surrender. The glass was cold under my fingertips. The room on the other side was small table, 2 chairs, a recorder, a prosecutor with a folder 3 inches thick. Bryce sat with his hands on the table. He looked younger than 24. He looked like the boy I had driven to college orientation 3 years ago, the boy who had carried my suitcase to the car and said, "Thanks, Mom," without being asked. That boy was gone. The person sitting in this room was calculating odds. "I will tell everything I know," he said. "Everything my father did. Everything Mark did. I want a deal." I watched my stepson beg through glass and felt the exact weight of what I had become, not cruel, not merciful, just finished. He wasn't confessing because he was sorry. He was confessing because Cassandra and Frank had structured the plea agreement so that cooperation was his only viable option. I had given him this chance. Not out of love, out of the recognition that a 24-year-old who had been recruited by his own father deserved one door that wasn't locked from the outside. I turned to Hank in the corridor. "Give him what he needs," I said. "He's not the one I came for." Hank nodded. From inside the room through the intercom, Bryce's voice came muffled and urgent. Quasia, wait." I looked at the intercom screen. His face was pressed close to the glass on his side. He couldn't see me, but he knew I was there. He knew I had been watching. His mouth moved. He was saying something else, my name, or Mom, or please. I couldn't tell. I pressed the mute button and kept walking. Outside February air hit my face. Cold, clean, the kind of air that makes your lungs ache and your eyes water. I stood on the precinct steps and breathed it in. My phone showed one unread message from Raymond Cole. Not text, a photograph. I opened it. A black and white image. My father, young 30, maybe younger. Sharp-jawed, unsmiling, standing at what looked like a prison gate. His hand was on the shoulder of a thin young man I didn't recognize, and behind them, partially in the frame, a woman holding a child. I stared at the photograph for a long time. Then I put the phone in my pocket and walked to my car. I had spent 49 days learning what my husband had done. I had never once asked what my father had done before I was born. I drove to Raymond's apartment that night. The photograph sat in my coat pocket, my father at 30 a prison gate. A thin young man, a woman, a child. Questions I didn't have answers to. A history I hadn't known existed. Raymond's rented room was on the second floor of a walk-up in Bed-Stuy. Small. Clean. The kind of room that smelled like instant coffee and old paper and wool blankets washed too many times. He opened the door without surprise, as if he had been expecting me since the moment he sent the photograph. He stepped aside and let me in. Arthur Langley was sitting in the corner. 74 years old, quiet, white-haired, a man I had met briefly at the gala, but never spoken to. He had known Raymond for decades, Cassandra told me. He was the one who had connected Raymond to Pastor Graves. He was the silent witness to whatever my father had done 31 years ago that had brought a stranger to my doorstep with a USB drive and a debt. I placed the photograph on Raymond's kitchen table. "Tell me," I said. Raymond sat across from me. He picked up the photograph and held it the way you hold something that has traveled a long distance carefully with both hands, the edges soft from years of folding. 31 years ago, he said. I was in a federal facility in upstate New York. Fraud. I was guilty. I owed restitution. I could never pay the kind of debt that follows you out the gate and buries you before you can stand up. He turned the photograph over. On the back in handwriting, I recognized my father's younger, sharper were 7 words. Never owe me anything. Just live well. Your father paid my debt, Raymond said. All of it. He didn't know me. We had no connection. A mutual acquaintance told him about my case, and he wrote a check and never mentioned it again. When I was released, he met me at the gate. That's this photograph. He shook my hand and said those words on the back, and then he left. How long have you known him? I asked. 31 years. He paid my debt. I never asked him to. Then why did you come to my door? Raymond looked at me with the steady, unhurried gaze I had first seen on my Brooklyn doorstep at 6:47 on a Tuesday morning. He didn't find me, he said. He just did the right thing, and the right thing finds its way to each other. The photograph was 31 years old, creased down the center where it had been folded and unfolded 1,000 times, a receipt for a debt that was never a debt at all. The woman and child in the background were Raymond's sister and nephew, he told me. They lived in North Carolina now. The sister had never known about the payment. Raymond had carried the photograph, and the secret, and the quiet gratitude, for 3 decades, waiting for the moment when repayment became possible. And when he heard through Arthur through channels I would never fully trace that Alexander Sterling's daughter was in danger, he had not hesitated. He had taken the recording that Hank's network had intercepted, put it on a USB drive, and walked to my door. I thanked him. He shook his head. Arthur stood in the corner and said nothing, the particular silence of a man who has witnessed something sacred and knows that words would diminish it. 5 days later, day 70, evening. Cassandra sent me a file at 9 p.m., not a document, a video. The subject line read, "From your father. Auto delivery, he hasn't logged into the system in 30 days. This was recorded 2 years ago." I sat at my kitchen table in the dark. The apartment was empty. Garrett gone, Bryce. Gone, the cameras removed by Hank's team a week ago. The only light was the laptop screen. I pressed play. My father's face filled the screen. He was sitting in his study, the leather chair, the bookshelves, the window behind him showing a Manhattan sunset. He looked healthier than the last time I had seen him. Stronger. The video was 2 years old. He had recorded this before the conspiracy, before the tea, before any of it. "I know you," he said. His voice was steady, unhurried. The voice of a man who had not rehearsed because he did not need to. "You don't need my protection. You just need to know that I see you. Not the Sterling heir. Not the teacher. Not the woman who hides from her own name. I see the 7-year-old girl reading alone on the front steps, and I see the woman she became. And they are the same person. You are always going to be strong enough. I just needed you to find out on your own." The video ended. 43 seconds. I sat in the dark for 11 minutes after it stopped, not because I was sad, but because I needed the silence to hold what he had given me, the knowledge that I had been seen my entire life without knowing it. Then I picked up my phone. "Dad. Daughter." I watched the video. A pause. The kind of pause that holds 30 years of fatherhood and 49 days of war, and a lifetime of choosing silence over control. "I know," he said. "Nothing more. Nothing needed." I hung up. Salt reached my lips, tears I had finally earned in a dark apartment alone, where no camera was watching and no performance was required. Then I opened my laptop. 2 emails. The first from the Sterling Corporation Board CEO appointment, effective immediately pending my acceptance. The second from Diane Mercer. Subject line, "The house on Prospect Street. We need to talk." Diane Mercer sat across from me in my father's old office, and for the first time since this began, I didn't know what to offer someone. The house on Prospect Street turned out to be simple. Diane had found a rental, a small brownstone in Brooklyn, where she wanted to start over away from Midtown, and the memories it carried. She didn't need my help finding it. She needed me to know that she was staying in New York, that she wasn't running, that the woman Garrett had tried to reduce to a footnote was putting down roots. I told her I understood. Then I asked her to come to the Sterling offices the following week. 4 months after the gala, she sat in the chair across from my desk. I slid an envelope toward her. "Name a number," I said. "You earned it." Diane looked at the envelope. She didn't touch it. "I don't want your money," she said. Her voice was steady, the same steadiness I had heard on the stage at the plaza, the steadiness of a woman who had decided what she was worth and refused to let anyone else set the price. "I want to apply for a position here. Any position. I need to start over in a place without memories." I looked at her for a long moment. The woman who had loved my husband without knowing he was mine. The woman who had stood on his stage and spoken her own name into a microphone because a man had told her she was nothing without him. She was not asking for charity. She was asking for a door. "Junior analyst," I said. "Start Monday." She nodded. She didn't smile. She didn't cry. She picked up her bag and walked out, and I sat alone in the office that still smelled like my father's leather chair, and watched the door close behind a woman who had chosen dignity over every easier option available to her. 2 months later, August, my first morning as CEO. You spend your whole life thinking power is something you take, and then one morning you walk into a building with your name on it and realize power is just the quiet privilege of choosing what to keep and what to let go. Arthur Langley held the lobby door. 74 years old, white-haired, standing in the same spot where he had stood for my father for years. He nodded as I passed. "Congratulations, Miss him," he said. The elevator carried me to the 38th floor. The doors opened onto the hallway I had walked once before the day Cassandra handed me the fake will in her office. This time I turned left instead of right and walked into the corner office. My father's office. My office now. The Manhattan skyline filled the windows. September light, warm golden, the kind of light that makes glass buildings look like they're burning from the inside. The desk was mahogany. The chair was leather. The bookshelves held 30 years of board reports and a framed photograph of my mother that my father had never moved. Cassandra appeared in the doorway. "Your father called," she said. "He said don't redecorate the office." "Tell him I already moved his chair to the window," I said. "He'll hate it." Cassandra almost smiled. Almost. Then she handed me the morning briefing and closed the door, and I sat down in a chair that still held the shape of the man who had sat in it before me, and I looked out the window at a city I had spent a decade pretending I didn't own a piece of. Through the glass 38 floors below, I could see the parking garage entrance, and in the garage, parked between a black Mercedes and a silver Audi, a 2009 Honda Civic with a scratched left mirror and faded paint. 1 month later, September. The end of a day that looked like every other day meetings, contracts, a lunch I ate at my desk. A call with the board that lasted 40 minutes longer than it needed to. I rode the elevator down, walked through the lobby, and pushed through the parking garage door into the concrete and motor oil air that smelled the same in every garage in every borough, no matter whose name was on the deed above it. My phone rang. Cordell Finch, 53, a corporate attorney I had known since college, blunt-spoken, the kind of friend who asked the questions nobody else would. He had watched everything from the outside, the gala, the trials, the headlines, and had said almost nothing until now. "Kwasia," he said, "I have to ask. Why don't you buy a new car? A CEO driving an old Civic looks strange." I stood in the parking garage and looked at my car. The faded blue paint. The scratched mirror from a parking lot in Brooklyn years ago, a minor collision I never fixed because it didn't matter. The worn leather steering wheel molded to my grip over 16 years. The Bodega coffee cup still sitting in the console from this morning, not the espresso from the machine upstairs in the corner office, but the $1.50 cup from the place on the corner that I had been buying coffee from since before any of this started. "Because this car reminds me who I was before it all happened," I said, "and who I will still be after it all ends." Cordell was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Fair enough," and hung up. I got in. I put the key in the ignition. It caught on the second turn, the familiar reluctance of an engine that had been starting this way for years and would keep starting this way until it finally decided not to. I pulled out of the Sterling Building garage and merged into 6 lanes of Manhattan traffic. Tinted windows passed on both sides. Benzes, BMWs. Black town cars with drivers who never looked sideways. The Civic's left mirror was still scratched. The steering wheel was still warm from the afternoon sun. The woman behind the wheel did not look back. And to you, listening to my story, remember this. I spent 23 years trusting the wrong people. I drank the tea my best friend handed me every night without question. I believed my husband when he said he loved me even when the words had gone hollow years ago. I could have kept living in that fog, comfortable quiet, dying slowly in ways no doctor would have caught in time. Don't make my mistake. Don't wait for a stranger on your doorstep to hand you the truth. Pay attention to the people closest to you. Sometimes the ones who smile the widest are the ones hiding the most. This family drama story taught me something I will carry for the rest of my life. Loyalty is not silence, and love is not obedience. The people who tried to destroy me counted on my trust, my patience, my willingness to believe the best in them. And for a long time, that almost worked. But I believe God put me through this for a reason, not to break me, but to show me who I really was beneath the marriage, beneath the name, beneath the years I spent making myself small, so others could feel tall. Every family drama story has a turning point. Mine came on a Tuesday morning. Yours might come quieter, a feeling, a conversation, a detail that doesn't add up. When it does, trust yourself. You have already survived more than you think. If this family drama story stayed with you, I want to hear from you. Tell me in the comments, did you see the betrayal coming? Or did it surprise you? Which moment hit you the hardest? Share this story with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you haven't already subscribed to Family Revenge so you never miss a story like this one, thank you for staying until the very end. It means more than you know. Some details in this story were fictionalized for narrative impact and reflection. Any resemblance to real individuals is purely coincidental. The message that your instincts deserve your trust is what I hope stays with you long after you close this page. God bless you all.
And that's how it all shoves you down at the end. I'm glad you will stay here. See you next time.